Good evening, Western Standard viewers, and welcome to Hannaford, a weekly politics show of the Western Standard. It is Thursday, December the 11th. As 2015 closes out, you could say that it has been a tempestuous year for Alberta politics, and especially for Premier Danielle Smith. A quasi-agreement with the Prime Minister over pipelines that may or may not lead anywhere. Separatists in her party and out of it who see pipelines as a litmus test of leadership. Where will that go? The support was solid at the party conference 3 weeks ago, but there were boos. Teachers legislated back to work, and in response, the Alberta Labour movement takes on the government with a total of 21 recall procedures initiated already, including that of Premier Danielle Smith. And creeping progress on healthcare, when people were hoping for, and to be fair, what was promised was quantum improvement 3 years ago. And of course, she is famous now for using the notwithstanding clause 4 times in 3 years. The miserable weather outside McDougall House here in Calgary could almost seem like a metaphor for the Danielle Smith government as the year ends. But what does the Premier think? Let's find out. Well, thank you for this, Premier.
My pleasure. Good to see you.
Well, it's good to have you on the show. It's kind of you to do it. Madam Premier, may we start with health education and pipelines? 3 quick questions in that order. Yesterday, you announced significant funding for assisted living. Mm-hmm. And one of the purposes was to free up acute care beds in hospitals which were occupied by people who needed care, but not hospital care.
Yeah.
All of that is great, but I remember our first interview when you had just become Premier, and you said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to get people out of the hospitals and into assisted living, and here we are, and we're announcing yesterday that we're going to do this again. When are we going to do the grand openings on these things?
Well, the thing that we had to do is create the authority to make some of these decisions. Remember, when we first started, AHS controlled everything. They were the purchaser, the provider, the evaluator. They contracted with themselves, contracted with others, and we didn't really have line of sight into what was happening in the hospitals. When Jason Nixon became the minister who was the lead on September 1st, one of the first questions he asked was, how many beds do we pay for in continuing care? And how many of them are empty? And the answer was, they didn't know. What was happening was that they didn't keep track of this. If a bed opened up, somebody made a phone call and somebody was supposed to keep track of it. He ended up having to hire a call center to figure out how many open beds that we had. We've now since automated that, and there's going to be a portal that comes out very soon. So that was one of the changes that needed to be made. We were also told that there were about 460 people who were living in hospital who needed long-term care. Well, that number turned out not to be true. It was closer to 2,000. And so one of the first things that we did is looked at our 16 acute care hospitals to find out where the problems were. There were some hospitals in the Edmonton area where 40% of the acute care beds were filled with alternative level of care patients. We just didn't have that information until Jason went in and started asking for it. So it is the Fraser Institute adage, if it matters, measure it.
Yes.
So we started measuring it. And as a result, we're now down to less than 1,000 in our 16 acute care hospitals. We're bringing the Edmonton area down into alignment with what we see elsewhere.
I mean, it's great that you've moved them out of the hospital, but do you mean you had these places that they could have gone just sitting empty?
We had a few. We had some beds, that were sitting empty that we were paying for, and we had to have a conversation with our service providers, saying we need to find places for these individuals. Some of them were very complex. There were 7 people who'd been in hospital for 1,000 days or more, and if we added up, it was a collective 18 years of them being in hospitals. So we had to find dedicated places for them to support their complex needs. When you say complex, some have dementia or mental health issues, some have addiction issues, some have anger management issues. Some of them are senior, some of them are not senior. These things all have to be dealt with. But our hospitals can't just be a catch-all for a difficult to place patient. We've got to find ways to place those patients. We discovered some patients were in hospital because the long-term care facility wouldn't take smokers. Well, how efficient is it to have nurses and doctors rolling somebody down for a smoke break? Not very. So that's another conversation we had to have with our service providers. So those are all things that we needed to do, is to make sure we were making use of our existing beds, finding ways to pay a proper support for those who were complex. And now we just have to build a whole lot more. We're probably about 3,000 beds short of those who need long-term care.
And when do you think that you're going to be able to have those 3,000 beds added to the inventory?
There's a couple of things that Minister Nixon is doing. One is repairs on existing beds. So there's about 800 that will be brought on stream. There's another 1,500 that are currently in operation. So those will come on stream this year. And then every year, it's going to be...
Like 2025?
Yes, 2026. 2026.
Okay.
Yes, coming year. So then every year after, we're going to be investing 1,500 beds a year until 2030. That's the kind of pace that we need in order to keep up. But the other part is the culture that we're trying to create, and the structure we're trying to create. Is we know people want to live at home in their own homes for as long as possible. So let's begin with giving the wraparound supports with home care and personal care and renovations. And then let's see if we can develop a kinship care program. So maybe they can move in with a daughter or son. And then you can move into independent living with assist. And then the continuum goes on to the round-the-clock care. And so if we can keep people in their own homes as long as possible, that really should be something that's going to be beneficial, not only for taxpayers, but I think more importantly, for the person receiving the care themselves. So we are well on our way, and we just wouldn't have been there if we hadn't made some of the structural changes that we did September 1st.
Well, let's talk about structural changes. Yesterday, I was speaking with a nurse, real person, and not one of these, people you invent to make a point, real person, and her question was, I know we need change, but what's it going to look like when it's done? Why will it work better? Can you explain what it is that Danielle Smith is trying to do with health?
Well, I can say that the restructuring is now done. And so rather than have a single authority responsible for everything, what we're going to now have is that Alberta Health Services will be responsible for the facilities they run on our behalf. They run 107 facilities, and their job will be to improve the patient experience from the moment you walk in the door to the moment you receive treatment to the moment that you're discharged. Their job will also be to maximize the use of their surgical theaters. We've been upgrading our surgical theaters, and many of them sit empty.
Why was none of this possible under the model that you inherited?
I think lack of focus, perhaps, because you had AHS, who was also managing Covenant Health, and AHS was managing 50 different charter surgical centers, and AHS was determining whether or not we would have international medical grads, and AHS was running the public health system, and AHS was running long-term care. So it's a focus issue. So now they will be focused on running the 107 facilities that are under their purview, and we will have under our primary and preventative care, we will be making sure that everybody is attached to a family doctor. That's going to be a separate area, so we can do international recruitment to make sure we have enough doctors and nurses so that everybody has a family practitioner. The long-term care will be a separate entity, and mental health and addiction will be a separate entity.
So what are the new incentives that are going to make the individuals... there was a sorry story you told me earlier about the beds being available, but nobody thought to pick up the phone and let anybody know. Clearly, somebody was not on top of their job. Okay, we have a new structure.
Yeah.
What are the incentives that are going to keep officials?
Well, the notion that we have is funding following the patient to the facility that's best able to give them the treatment. And one of the reasons we know this will work is when we look at our charter surgical facilities, and there's 50 of them, we pay them based on the surgeries they do.
Right.
And as a result, they've gone from doing 40,000 surgeries when we first started to 65,000 surgeries. At the same time, AHS has just gotten back to the level of surgeries that we started doing, that we were doing in 2019, even though they've had $3.5 billion more. So everyone is now going to be paid. on the basis of the surgeries that they do, especially on the elective side. And we think that that's going to increase the number of surgeries that are done. I'll tell you an example of what I think will happen in practice. If you want to go look at the Humber River model, it's a public hospital in Ontario. And what they realized is that if they gave a surgeon 2 operating room suites in the same 8-hour block, they could get way more production out of those operating room suites. Because a lot of what happens in hospitals is downtime. You go and do your surgery, then you sit back and wait for 45 minutes until the operating room is reestablished with the patient in there, and then you go in. So our typical,
Kind of like what the dentists do.
Completely go back and forth between the rooms. So and I'll tell you what happens. So normally you might get 4 surgeries done in a surgical time block in a public hospital in Alberta right now. Humber River, they did 14 in the same 8-hour time block. So that's the kind of thing we're trying to incentivize, is that if you can do more surgeries in a more efficient way, find a way to restructure your staff, find a way to restructure how you manage your operating rooms, then we want to reward you for it. That's going to make a big difference.
Okay, got it. Education. One of the big problems is clearly that there's a lot of people who don't speak English being pushed into the classrooms, and then the door closes and you've got one teacher there and it's very hard to teach.
Correct.
Why don't we stream people?
Well, we're having that conversation now. One of the things I'd say about what we've learned about the complexity issue is that we have a number of kids who are in the classroom who have very high needs, aggression issues, or very high medical needs. And so we know that there are specialized classrooms in a lot of different school systems where those kids are getting smaller classrooms, more one-on-one. Maybe we need to do more of that. But when we looked at the data, what we discovered is that the number of kids who speak English as a second language has doubled in the last 3 years. It is now up to 96,000 students in a school system of 750,000 kids. And so the good news about English language learners is it's one of those things that with the right resources, somebody can become well-spoken in English. So we have to find new ways to make sure that those kids get connected with resources. And I can give you an example. We had a large number of Ukrainians who came during in the immediate months following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And many of them found themselves in the school system. I met a couple of young girls, one who'd been here 6 months, one who'd been here 9 months. And they were able to give a presentation about a business idea at Junior Achievement after being here for a very short period of time. But you have to put the dedicated resources in so they can develop that ability in English so that they can then go on to be integrated into a classroom. So I think what you'll see in the new year, as we've identified that is the biggest part of the pressure in our classrooms, where we'll have some dedicated resources for that.
Okay. All right. Let's talk pipelines for a moment. Yesterday in British Columbia, the court ruled that BC legislation has to conform to UNDRIP and UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Persons, all their legislation has to conform to that. That puts an awful lot of leverage in the hands of Indigenous BC leaders, just at a time when you have a memorandum of understanding with the Prime Minister about pipelines that even he fell short of saying, well, if we say it goes, it goes. Everybody has to be on side. I know you still believe in the pipeline, but why? There seems to be so much working against it.
Well, I can tell you, I've been critical of judges' rulings and how it's upended a lot of the legislative agenda that we've wanted to do, and I've had to use the notwithstanding clause a few times. I noticed with great interest that Premier David Eby is now saying how outraged he is at the decisions coming down on the court that has upended his private property and land titles legislation, as well as his mineral investment regime. So he is going to, it sounds to me, do some either modifications to the legislation or challenge that in court. So I think we're all beginning to see that from time to time, judges don't always make a decision that's in sync with the people, and then they're not always right. So I'm going to watch to see how that unfolds. But when it comes to Indigenous resource development, one of the things I would point out in British Columbia is it was actually the Indigenous communities that led the development on LNG. I know we had a hard time getting Coastal GasLink built, but in the end, The reason why LNG Canada and Silisms and wood fiber and others are being proposed is because there's Indigenous proponents to it. So we think that that's a good common ground to start from. And so my Indigenous Relations Minister has been going to BC quite a lot and having a number of meetings to begin the engagement. If we find the right port, and I have to tell you, I mean, I just saw an interview with the Prince Rupert Port Authority saying that Prince Rupert is probably the safest port in Canada because it's right on the water, deep water, very little navigation, straight run to Asia in 8 to 10 days. I think that that is a good starting point if we're talking about safety and talking about the way in which we can get our products to market on an established port. And we've got to work with the nations in order to have a joint ownership. And I think
So you still believe we'll get a pipeline out of all of this? All right.
I wouldn't have signed the MOU if I didn't think so. But in the meantime, we also got rid of the emissions cap. We also got rid of the clean electricity regs. Those were the two things I've been advocating against for the past 3 years. We had national advertising campaigns, and it's already demonstrated that it's having an impact on investment decisions. You've got Enbridge, you've got Trans Mountain, you've got South Bow, all talking about new projects to increase the amount of egress for pipelines. You've also got Capital Power talking about how now that the clean electricity regs are gone, they want to do a major investment in natural gas power generation, which will fuel AI data centers. So those two things alone, I think, are going to make a huge impact in our investment climate. And then I just have a little bit more work to do to work out the technical specs for the pathway and route on the pipeline to the BC coast, but I'm confident that we'll be able to persuade.
Maybe so, because for some members of your party, that getting a pipeline is a sort of a litmus test on leadership. One last thing before we go.
Let me just say to that, though. So if we get 400,000 barrels from Enbridge Mainline, if South Bow does another 650,000 barrel line, if Trans Mountain expands 360,000 barrels, if we get oil by rail to Sydney, Nova Scotia, if we end up with a pipeline going to Churchill so that we're able to export, I would look at all of that as success. And it's going to take a little bit longer to do the BC pipeline. But what we needed to do is create an environment where all of those projects would go ahead. And that's what I'm hoping that we'll see in the coming months.
I notice, to end on a frivolous note, that the Canadian Taxpayers Federation gave you a big thumbs up. They have a naughty and nice list that they publish every year. And apparently the fact that you used the notwithstanding clause and saved Alberta taxpayers $2 billion puts you on their nice list. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. Now, the thing is to stay on the nice list. So for 2026, a tax break for Alberta taxpayers?
Well, we're looking at
that would do it.
We did our tax break. We accelerated our tax cut this year, so $750 for each individual, $1,500 for a family. But I can tell you, we have a $7.5 billion deficit that we're looking at because the reality is that our budget needs $74 oil to balance. Oil's been below $60. You can just do the math on that. For every dollar that WTI is short, it's $750 million to our treasury. So that's a big problem that we've got to deal with. We're starting to deal with it because we're investing the income from the Heritage Fund into the fund so that it can grow to $250 billion to generate a new income source for us. But we have to stick with that plan. And we quite frankly are we're not going to be able to balance our budget under the current environment. So that's very much top of mind about how we're going to get back into balance.
Madam Premier, it's always a pleasure. Thank you for this. Yes. And Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you. Good to see you.
Thank you.